What do you need him to be a refuge for today? Where has the earth given way to you this week? And allow the stillness to minister to you rather than to distract you. The same God that breathed life into you, who spoke the world into existence, the one who created the sun and the moon and the stars and the mountains and the seas, is the same God who is ever present in trouble. He is the same God who loves you, who provides your needs, the same God who rescued you from the dominion of darkness and brought you into the light. God, we need you to be ever present now. And Lord, if you don't show up, then it'll be a fun morning hanging out together. But what we need is you. We need your Spirit to teach us and to counsel us and to hang on to us. We need your word to divide deep in us and to help us know how to live more like Jesus. And God, we need to hear your voice. We need to know that you're there. Because only you can meet each one of us in the exact place where we are at the same time, even though it's all different. So God, we just ask for that, for you. If we have you, we'll have enough. God, would you please do that work in us today for your glory? It's in Jesus' name that we all pray. Amen. Thank you for leaving room for that. It's nice to see you all today. Thanks for being here. It's good to see you. When you come to church to worship God with your family, it's kind of a different setting than just going to church because that's where you go to church, right? It's nice to know that your family's going to be there. It's nice to know that you can come as you are and you'll be met with kindness and love and grace, and that you all have the same opportunity to be made different. I was deeply convicted by last week's message, which is annoying as the pastor. It happens more often than you think, like every week, but this one in particular hit me real deep. And I realized that I don't know how to suffer that well. And so I believe that God is giving me unique opportunities to grow in that area, to develop endurance and character and hope. You know, I sat and I was like, man, what would I have done? I've thought about this. I've been dwelling on this all week long, so forgive me for sharing a little bit. When I read about what gave Paul the ability to have peaceful confidence that we talked about last week, I questioned myself whether I would be able to do the same thing. I questioned whether I was that kind of man. Do I have that type of endurance? Do I have that kind of character? Have I developed that level of hope? Is my relationship with God so confident that I could have peace in the middle of those confrontations? Confrontations have not been my strong suit in my life. I've had confrontations mostly because I got picked on most of my life. I was small and skinny and kind of weird. It's the best way to say. That's what people told me anyways. And then you grow up, right? And you get older and you start learning how to, and then you swing the pendulum the other way, right? And you might like confrontations. You know who you are. And so does everybody else, right? We like confrontations, but you find out who you are in those settings. You don't find out who you are as a person, what your character is like, what your endurance is like when you're around all your friends with no confrontation. It's when you are confronted in your faith or you're confronted in your character when you figure out who you really are. I had a conversation last night about this. We were remembering different opportunities we had to develop character and confrontation. And I was reminded of all my failure. And I hope I'm not talking to myself. I feel like I'm talking to myself, and that's okay. I'm going to tell you anyway. Okay, good. Thank you. Because I realized, now, there's times where I've been pretty hopped up. Even in my faith, somebody attacks Jesus. I'm like, it's game time, son. I just go, man, I don't think that's what the example is. And I'm not even talking about Paul. Like, where do we find our example in confrontation? Where do we find our example when we're up against it, especially because of our faith? I think our kids know. If you're in school these days, being kids, high school students, especially going to college, it's very antagonistic to people who love Jesus. Very antagonistic. And I'm sitting here wondering, I wonder if I've trained my kids, what am I doing with my children? Right? Like, what do we teach them? I send them to school for however long. What are they learning about how to be confronted well in their faith? We pay a ton of money for colleges. For what? Now, this is no ding on teachers, by the way. I love you, front lines. You don't get paid enough. I got your back. Seriously. But what we are sending our kids into in the world is not helping them be developed in the classroom. That's not what's being taught in schools. We are all for academic and athletic excellence, right? But what about spiritual excellence? What about being able to prepare them for real confrontation? So I don't know. So my question, I guess, I wonder if you've ever wondered what kind of person you are. Have you ever questioned, like, I wonder what my character is? I wonder if I was in this same setting that Paul was in, back to the scriptures, right? If I was put in this position to suffer for the name of Christ, the way that Paul and others have suffered for the name of Christ, more so that Jesus suffered for his own name, I wonder, would I be prepared to do so in a way that is revealed in the scriptures? Maybe you never asked yourself that. I don't know. But I think we should ask ourselves that and figure out, where do we find our example? Where is it that we figure out how to do it well? So we're going to talk about that today. We'll be in Acts chapter 23. Last week we talked about Acts 22, where Paul is giving a defense for his ministry. But more than that, we talked in Romans 5. Remember that, about why he was able to defend his faith in Jesus in such a peaceful, confident manner. And we're going to talk about three confrontations that Paul had in this chapter, and hopefully glean where we find our example and how to prepare ourselves to be confronted in our faith well. Paul finds himself before the council. He finds himself before Jesus, and he finds himself before a governor. The conspirators, sorry. He does find himself before a governor. We're not going to talk about that one yet. And this is the same council that we'll find in the first few chapters that tried Peter and John, the 12 apostles, and Stephen, and they also tried Jesus. So let's jump into it. But on the next day, desiring to know the real reason why he was being accused by the Jews, he unbound him. This is Paul, the tribune unbound him, and commanded the chief priests and all the council to meet. And he brought Paul down and set him before them. Verse 1, it says, and looking intently at the council. You know what happened the last time Paul looked intently at somebody? I feel like this is Paul's superpower. He was preaching, right? He looked at that guy. He says he looked intently at him. And then he's like, get up and walk. When Paul looked intently at you, it was like, it's about to go down. And Paul, it says, he looked intently at the council and he said, brothers, I have lived my life before God in all good conscience up to this day. I have lived my life in all good conscience up to this day. The last time that they tried to kill me, the last council that I stood before, the shipwrecks, all the things that I have been through, I have lived my life with all good conscience up to this day. He uses this word conscience like over 20 times. He loves this word. And it's interesting, we talk about conscience, ignoring your conscience. I was really good at ignoring my conscience. His conscience didn't condemn him even if the Jews had. Like in the middle of being condemned by others, false accusations, lies about what he was doing, stirring up trouble, all those things, he says that you may condemn me, but the spirit in me doesn't. My conscience doesn't condemn me. And I think that there's a couple things about our conscience that's really important, because every time that we operate against the conviction of the Holy Spirit in our lives, our conscience, it develops scales on our heart, right? It develops kind of a dirty window pane. And I'm going to explain it like this. The conscience, it might be compared to a window that lets in light. Right? In God's law, the scriptures, his truth is the light, and the cleaner the window, the more light shines in. So every time that we live against our conscience, it dirties that window and becomes more difficult, right, to be receiving the light that's meant for us, to guide us and to lead us and to help us to operate with peaceful confidence in all the things. Every time that we operate with the conviction of the Spirit, with our conscience, right? You ever have the e-cloths? Anybody who cleans windows knows what I'm talking about. They're amazing, no streaks. But that's what happens, right? That window stays clean. It's just relationship with God. It's not about do's and don'ts or good and bad. It's just the idea that that's what's helping guide us. Our conscience doesn't make the standards. It only applies the standards of the person, right? Whether good or bad, right or wrong. Let's keep going. And the high priest, Ananias, commanded those who stood by him to strike him on the mouth. This is where it would all break down for me. I'm just being honest. I would love to be the pastor that stood up here and be like, yeah, I could take that. I could take it. But I know in myself, I have some work to do in order to know how to be confronted like this. Because Ananias was not a righteous man. He was an unrighteous man. He was a terrible high priest. He was corrupt. And he ordered somebody who had lived his life with good conscience to be struck in the mouth. And then Paul said, this is why I love Paul. He said, God's going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. See, I feel like that would be, if that was the standard, I'm good. You know what I mean? If that was the standard, and people argue, I was reading some commentary on this, and people are like, oh, he was justified in that. Like, I feel like Paul was probably not exactly all righteous. Now, he wasn't wrong, but if you look at John chapter 18, you see this mirror image. This is what Jesus, I told you last week in 22, right? You watch Jesus go through his trial. He stood and they ordered him to be struck in the mouth too when he was testifying to the truth. This same court ordered that Jesus be struck, and his response was totally different. And the reason this is important is because Jesus is our example, not Paul. Paul was an amazing disciple of Jesus, but, he's a human being after all. He says, God's going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. In case you guys don't know what they would do is there was a wall that could be defective, and they'd whitewash it so it looked clean on the outside, right? Jesus talked to the Pharisees about this. You're just like a whitewashed tomb. There's death inside, but it looks clean on the outside, so it's nice and you can see a nice appearance on the outside, even though it's dead on the inside. He said, go ahead and strike me. God's going to strike you. Are you sitting to judge me according to the law? Right? This first confrontation with the council, Paul is testifying to the truth, and he is experiencing something that Jesus has already experienced. He's going through something that Jesus has already been through and led by example. Interesting. It made me think about when we look to examples about how to live our life, do we look at people or do we look at Jesus? Do we follow people that are tangible and mostly good, or do we follow the Christ? Because it's in there. And we're talking a lot about Paul and the disciples and the church on mission and all that. But Paul's example wasn't the high priest. His example was Jesus, as was the other disciples. So they have this conversation. Paul apologizes for speaking against the high priest because he says, you shall not speak evil against the ruler of your people. Right? That's from the law back in the Old Testament. So then Paul does this genius thing. He doesn't just use his heart, he uses his mind in this confrontation, and he realizes that there's Sadducees and Pharisees. The Pharisees, of whom he has been one, believe in the resurrection and angels, and the Sadducees do not. So he says, the reason I'm standing before you is because of the resurrection of the dead. And the Pharisees are like, there's nothing wrong with this guy. Let's let him go. And the Sadducees are all in an uproar. And Paul's just like, mic drop. Like he just lobs this thing in the middle of the room. He has wisdom in the middle of the confrontation, right? Let's look at verse 10, going into verse 11. And when the dissension became violent, the tribune, afraid that Paul would be torn to pieces by them, commanded the soldiers to go down and take him away from among them by force and bring him into the barracks. So they're like, all right, Paul, you've done enough. Let's grab him. And he took him into the barracks to keep him from being ripped to pieces. Up to this point, we've seen Paul, they've tried to stone him. They've abused him. They've thrown him out. They've tried to kill him. Right? He's been on the run. He's going through it, and he knew that he was going to go through it, right? As God calls us into following him, there's this thing that we forget, that he already knew what it was going to be like when he called us to follow Jesus. And there are times, like today, Christian shared Psalm 27, I think, this morning in our prayer time this morning. It was wonderful, right? There are these moments as you go, right when you feel like you've had enough, and God says, hey, I'm here. I'm here. You hear a word from the scriptures. Maybe somebody speaks some truth into your life they didn't know you needed. And this is what happens. The second confrontation after the council, Paul has now this fourth vision, this fourth interaction with Jesus in his journey. It says, verse 11, the following night the Lord stood by him and said, take courage. Take courage, for as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so you must testify also in Rome. And I think a lot of times we think, oh, that's such an encouraging word, but there's something that's really important here that helps us understand how we can be in confrontation better, fulfill the call better, follow Jesus better. He didn't just say take courage, but he revealed to him that God knew that he was going to go to Rome. So even if he felt like he was going to die right now, even if he felt like it was not going to work out, even if he felt like this was the end of Rome, God had the last say, and God said he's going to go to Rome. So you're going to go to Rome. Those moments of encouragement from the scriptures are not meant to be like, hey, good job, it's the end of the road. Although maybe when it's the end of the road, that might be the case. But in this particular instance, when he was confronted by this harsh reality and again having to defend his faith, he said, look, not only am I want to give you encouragement, but I want you to be confident of the call that I have on your life. Because as we talked over the last few weeks, it's easy to quit, isn't it? Remember we talked, it's always too soon to quit. And then I screwed up the whole Finding Nemo thing last week, right? And we just keep going, just keep going. This third confrontation he had was with some conspirators. Verse 12 says, When it was day, the Jews made a plot and bound themselves by an oath, neither to eat nor drink till they had killed Paul. There were more than 40 who made this conspiracy. So there are over 40 people who's like, all right, we've had enough of this guy. He's caused all these problems. He's messing up our financial plan. He's getting in the way of our good paganism, like our sinfulness. We don't want somebody telling us we can't do all this stuff. Right? We're trying to get ours, and he keeps coming up with this whole Jesus is the only way business. And they come up and they look, we've had enough. They made an oath. It'd be like all of us over here. Let's make an agreement that we won't eat or drink. That includes lunch after church. We won't eat or drink until we kill this fool. Everybody in? All right, kill Paul on 3. This is what they do. And then they go to the chief priest and they're like, hey, you tell us where he's going to be and we're going to be waiting for him and we're going to take him out. Take courage. For you have testified about the facts to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so you must testify also in Rome. Even a plot against your life can't be the last word if God has a different plan for you. And these conspirators thought that they could end Paul's story, but they forgot that the God who made him was also the God who was still watching over him, who was still leading, who was still drawing, who was still writing the story, and they couldn't actually edit that story at all. These 40 or more conspirators to kill Paul thought that they could fix the story their way, and they forgot that the sovereign God of the universe was the one watching over Paul. Because God had promised to deliver him. See, God told him that he was going to suffer. You remember this? When he came to Christ, when he had this Damascus Road thing, he said, you're going to suffer for my name. Okay. I don't know anybody who's like, you're going to suffer for my name. Is like, hey, is there another assignment? Is there another role that I can play in your plan? No, you're going to suffer. He says, but I'll deliver you from your enemies. I'll deliver you from your enemies. And so Paul held on to these promises, and all along the way, God had to remind him, as he does us, right? Think about the last time that you were ready to give up on the call and purpose that God had for you. Think about that. Think about how God encouraged you through it, and if he didn't yet, it's right now. Think about it. Along the way, have you had those moments? Maybe it was a professor if you're in college. Maybe it was a teacher. Maybe it was a parent who just continually came against your faith. Maybe it was yourself. Maybe your conscience has become so seared. Maybe it's because you have set aside that prompting from God's Spirit so much that the light feels like darkness in you. Listen, God had to remind Paul just the way he reminded Jesus. Did you know that? Jesus found himself in the Garden of Gethsemane, praying so hard that blood came out. Asking God, is there any way? Right? It was heavy. It's not like taking on the sins of the world is some light burden. That's not like a Saturday project. The sovereign God of the universe entered in, was present, an ever-present help in trouble. An ever-present help in trouble. You know what that word ever-present means? Always present. Always present. Always looking over, always understanding what's needed, always writing the story. And our inability to understand the beginning from the end does not change the fact that God is in control of the whole story. My inability to understand what he's doing and why he's asking me to suffer for his name is irrelevant to the story. It's not his fault, it's mine. And he says, hey, I got you. I've got you. So these conspirators, they sent him, his nephew finds out. We don't know much about the nephew and his sister, but they want to know more about why he's being accused. And I'll let you read the last bit of 23 a little bit later. But basically what ends up happening is they send 470 people. They find out about the conspiracy. God figures out that he can be taken care of. And because he's a Roman citizen, he has some perks. And because of his citizenship and his birthplace, they provide 470 soldiers to take him where he needs to go. He ends up in Caesarea, awaiting his opportunity to be heard by the governor Felix, which we'll talk about next week. You can write this down if you want. If we will dare to follow Jesus, like Paul and like others, come what may, let Jesus' example push us to prepare for what may actually come. If we dare to follow Jesus, like all the way in, right? If we dare to pursue his call and purpose according to the scriptures, not according to our culture, not according to our desires or our wants or our platform or our whatever, according to the scriptures and according to his will, if we dare to follow him like that, come what may, then let Jesus' example push us to prepare for what may actually come. And I'm not saying that everyone is going to they're going to try to kill you, or that your call is to do exactly what Paul did. But Jesus did make it very, very clear that persecution will come. And we need to be prepared. It goes back to that original question of mine. I wonder if I have the character to manage. And make disciples of them. What am I teaching my children? What am I teaching my friends? Are we discipling one another to be prepared for these sorts of confrontations, whether it be the council? Are we prepared to stand with Jesus and hear him tell us this? I don't know. Paul was so connected to him that he had these conversations. He could hear him. If we're going to look to Jesus for our example, I want you to hear this. He says in Matthew chapter 10, behold, I am sending you out as sheep in the midst of wolves, so be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. Beware of men, for they will deliver you over to courts and flog you in their synagogues, and you'll be dragged before governors and kings for my sake to bear witness before them and the Gentiles. This was not spoken to Paul, by the way. This was spoken to his disciples and those listening. And I bet Paul knew. Jesus is giving us an understanding of what to expect. Now, I know he's speaking to his disciples, but you and I are his disciples also. Right? And these words were not meant for 12 men. They were meant for people who will dare to follow him, according to the scriptures and the will of God. It says, when they deliver you over, don't be anxious about how you're to speak or what you're to say, for what you will say will be given to you in that hour. This is why Paul stood before people, why Jesus stood before people. He said this over and over. Hey, if they haul you into court today and you do not prepare your defense, and they say, tell me why you're being accused today, he's saying that God, through his Spirit, will give you everything you need to say in the heart and spirit you need to say it if you will just listen. If you will trust that he is with you. Because what did he say in Matthew 28 before we started the book of Acts? Go do all these things, make disciples, teach them everything I'm teaching you, and lo, I am with you for the first 2 weeks. Or the first 6 months, or the first 12 years of your following. No, he says, I am with you always. There's this matter of trust on the front end, knowing it will be so that when we find ourselves in the circumstances and confrontations, we can have that peaceful confidence and we can testify in a way that reflects who God really is and not who Jonny Marks most likely is. He says you're going to be hated by all for my name's sake, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. A disciple is not above his teacher, nor a servant above his master. If Jesus had to endure it the way he endured it, we should expect that it's going to be the same for us. It was the same for Paul. It was the same for the disciples. It will be the same for us. We are not above our master, Jesus. And the good news is that he gave us a great example, which we'll talk about in a quick sec. So have no fear of them, verse 26 in chapter 10 of Matthew, for nothing is covered that will not be revealed. And do not fear those who will kill the body but cannot kill the soul. Rather fear him who can destroy both soul and body in hell. And then he says, verse 30, but even the hairs of your head are numbered. The idea is that he's involved in our lives. He's not left us as orphans in the world. So how do we follow Jesus' example in these moments? Well, the first is, as we've talked about, our example is higher than people. Paul was a great disciple, but he wasn't Jesus. Paul got his example from Jesus, and so do we. Jesus has to be our example. Go read about his arrest. Go read about his trials. Go read about how he functioned on the cross. Go read in Peter how he said when they insulted him, he didn't insult them back. He kept quiet. He entrusted himself to the one who judges justly. He trusted that God was in charge. Second one is this: be prepped in prayer. Jesus stayed connected to the Father out of desire and out of necessity. He relied on the power of his heavenly Father to get him through the purpose and call that he had. He was able to remain steadfast, and Paul, because they were listening to the voice of God as they went. The third thing is to be resigned to the call no matter what comes. Paul was the guy who was like, look, come what may. Jesus, come what may. I'm resolved and resigned to do what God asked me to do no matter what. It's always too soon to quit. And just keep going. And you can put me on trial. You can give me the stripes. You can insult me. You can spit on me. You can strike me in the mouth. But this truth of Jesus is not going to stop while I'm alive. And we have to do the same, to be resigned to the call, to share Jesus and to make disciples with the whole world until there's no more breath in our lungs. And the last is that God has the last word. God has the last word. No matter what it seems like, even if 40 or more come to kill you and conspire against you, God has the last word. He's the author of the book, and he's the one that will pen the last word. And we have to trust that as we go. So here's my challenge to us. Here's my challenge. What are we actually preparing ourselves for? What are we spending our time being ready for? How are we engaging the conflict and confrontation that comes from Jesus? Not from us. We've talked about the difference. And who's your example? And if Jesus is your example, do you know what that example is? Get in the Word. Understand what it says. Let it sink in so that we can be resigned to this call that we have on this earth. Because at the end of the day, when we stand before God, he will not care about your report card. And he will not care about your trophies. He won't care how many Olympic medals you have or don't have. He won't care how well dressed you were. He won't care how successful you were. He won't care about those things. What he will care about is whether or not we testify to the truth of Jesus Christ as the only Savior of the world. And he will care about how we made disciples of those who came to faith. And I'm not trying to diminish anything that we do in the earth, but when we focus our whole attention on those things, we can't be resigned to the call because we're resigned to our call instead of his. Let's be a church. Let's be a church who doesn't look to Jesus as a way for us to feel better about ourselves, but as a means of example for how to live our life on a daily basis and how to change the world through the grace that comes through Jesus. Let's be that kind of church.